So coming up next, we have two sessions, session 6 and 7 on stages 1 and 2 in parallel. On stage 1, which is this stage, we have Jennifer, from Pinterest, who's going to be talking about building a testing culture at Pinterest. And on stage 2, we have David Jones from Percy, who's going to be talking about going from zero to hero with visual Percy and visual testing. So okay, let's get started. So welcome, Jennifer. Thank you for joining us. It's great to have you on board. So Jennifer is basically going to be talking about how they built a testing culture at Pinterest. I think she describes herself as fun, quirky, clever, and sassy. And she is a software engineer at Pinterest, where she upholds the quality of metrics and works on integration testing tools. Prior to Pinterest, she worked on startups and consultancies of various sizes. And she prides herself on improving company culture and standards while focusing on end user experiences and advocating for diversity in tech. All right, Jennifer, over to you.
All right, thank you so much. Let me just get my slides up here, and thank you so much again for that wonderful introduction. So it'll just take me a second to get my first slide up. All right. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me as I'm going to talk about building a testing culture. As Praveen mentioned, this is something that I'm very passionate about, and this talk is based on my experiences building up testing culture at Pinterest and at other places. So yeah, I hope you enjoy this from the comfort of wherever you're watching. So I'm Jennifer Oviña. As mentioned, I'm from the Metrics Quality and Test Tools team at Pinterest, where we safeguard all of our metrics as well as we own the testing frameworks between iOS, Android, and web. So let's just jump right into the talk. Culture. There's a lot of definitions for the word culture, and there's a lot of literature that's also been written on the subject. For the purposes of this talk today, we're going to define culture as what people do unprompted. Right? So what this means is, how do people behave when an enforcing figure isn't there? For testing specifically, this means, how are people behaving when the testing team isn't around to tell them what to do? Right? So from this, we can venture to say that a testing culture that is good is one where people are empowered to create, run, debug tests, and we go one step beyond that to say that they should also be able to own them and self-advocate for these tests. Now, if this sounds too good to be true, or you can't really picture your organization into what I just said, that's perfectly fine. I also want to share with you some tools to help these systems improve, right? So there are two tools in particular that I want to share with you today, which are the testing culture ladder and a checklist for change. Oops. Oh no, sorry. There you go, a checklist for change. There you go. So these two tools are distilled from my experiences moving Pinterest and other companies through to a better testing culture. And these are a high-level view of what you can do and steps that you can take to change the company from one section to the other, right? So let's start with the testing culture ladder. If you think of a ladder, thinking of 1 as the lowest rung and 4 as the top, the steps in a testing culture are 1, non-existent, 2, struggling, 3, established, and 4, strong. So how do you move your company from a non-existent test structure to one that has a strong testing culture? Well, to get a better understanding of that, let's go into a little bit of what these stages could look like in production. Once I just want to let you know that this is not a completely exhaustive list of what it could look like, just some examples that I have seen before, as well as what the definition is. That way we have a better idea of what it looks like to move through these stages, right? So let's start with non-existing. At this point, you don't really have any established practices. And by practices here, we mean like testing practices, right? So you don't really have a wiki that you can point to that says like, this is how you run tests. You might not even have tests at this point. So in production, what this could look like is just having frequently broken pushes, like maybe you're at an early stage of your company, and every so often, or pretty frequently actually, that you have to roll back these changes, right? No problems are identified. What I mean by identity here and like identifying is maybe like in this, startup scenario that we're going through, we're going to have a search function, and maybe that search function is really brittle, right? Every time someone makes a change in the code, search breaks, but no one's really identified it as a problem. It's just kind of been fixed every time it comes up, right? You will have infrequent testing if you have any testing at all. So that might mean like, one or two people on the team or one or two individuals are looking at testing. They might be doing this testing, but on the grand scale, it's not getting done very often. The key here is a lack of consistency. Whatever you do and whatever you have in place isn't consistently implemented, which is usually a sign of not having very strong investment. And as a whole, testing is mostly ignored. Okay, so now we know what a non-existing test culture looks like. So what's the step up from that? Struggling. In this case, you might have some practices installed. You know that you should be testing, but you should be testing doesn't always mean that you are testing, right? So in this scenario, you might have some broken pushes, like you have some good ones, you have some bad ones. So you're still rolling back every so often, but it's just kind of the way things go. You might have identified a few problem areas. So like we're going to be going with the same example. So we know that search gets broken pretty often. Whenever someone makes a change, like we should probably look at search here, right? But there's inconsistent testing. So there's really nothing in place that makes sure that you're consistently testing at this point. So like, maybe there's a few people that remember to check for the search function to be fixed, right? And then maybe they also identify, well, if we need to have search working, maybe we should also have login working too, right? You have a few places that you've identified that you want to focus on, which you do have a limited investment. So that's usually why you have to pick and choose a few places to look at. But at this point, your testing might be outdated or even outright ignored. So maybe you do have some testing and it does run regularly, but its output is usually red. You go and you see like, oh, like 2 tests pass out of 50. Great, right? And if you're still pushing with these tests broken, that means that you're not really invested into the testing framework, right? And as a result of all of this, you usually have a few points of contact, if you have any, for the testing framework. Like maybe the person that set it up is still around and they can tell you a little bit about it, but since no one adopted it, it's just very low on their list of items to do. This is what a struggling testing culture looks like. You can see that there's a few elements here, but really not enough to, hang your hat on. So from that, we move to an established testing culture. Here, you do have some best practices. You do have some idea of like where your testing is, where it's going. What this looks like in production is now you have fewer broken pushes, right? You're mostly good. You still have some rollbacks, like, that's fine. But for the majority of the time, your pushes are good. You're testing multiple areas. You've identified logging, you've identified search, you've identified maybe user settings or something like that. And you have a cadence of testing to make sure that these problem areas are in check. At this point, your tests are maintained because you do have regular testing. You do have fewer broken pushes, right? So all of these feed together to make sure that your pipeline is a little bit healthier, which also means that you have a lot more investment in your testing as well. And here you can find pockets of advocates. And what I mean by pockets of advocates is like, it's not just one or two people that are strongly saying testing is important, we should invest in this, we should keep going with this. But, maybe it's people within those problem areas. It might be people from outside that recognize the value of testing and actively advocate for it on their team. Maybe like the lead for search is just like, I know that search is brittle. We're working on fixing that, but in the meantime, we need to make sure that every time we change something on search, we should be updating our tests, right? This is an advocate. This is the sort of people that the more you have in a company, the better your testing culture is. So going off of that, a strong testing culture has a very established practice and is one where your team is empowered not only to create, test, run, debug all these tests, but like maintain them to a level where they can dictate, I don't think this test is necessary. And like, that might be at the higher tiers, but, that they can decide for themselves what should and shouldn't exist within their testing realm, right? So at this stage, you rarely have broken pushes. You're testing multiple stages even, which is different from multiple sites. Like maybe you have like different environments, you're, beta testing some things, like you have a more complex testing system and testing pipeline. And at this point, you might also want to think about bringing in testability guarantees. So what this will do is it will guarantee a minimum investment into these tests, because if they are below the stability threshold that you've established, then those tests will be removed, right? So you can see how having this sort of guarantee will sort of self-feed into this better testing practice in itself. Optional here, depending on like your structure of the company, but you could also have distributed ownership, where it's like we talked about, the famous search example now, that search team owns their own tests. They dictate what goes into their tests, what is important, what features they want to make sure are okay. Because maybe something is very important for search, but not important, for the whole company. You have proactive improvement here, which is also, if you do have a stability guarantee, that kind of helps with a proactive improvement. Proactive improvement basically means that I try to look for problems within the testing structure before they become real problems. It could be something as simple as, hey, I'm writing a new feature and I think I should create some tests, right? So this is proactively creating something that way it doesn't become trouble further down the line. And in this culture, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, you have advocacy, right? So that means that every person in one way, shape, or form knows the importance of tests, even if they aren't shouting from the rooftops, oh my God, I love testing, everyone should be testing. In this stage, people understand why it's important to run these tests, and even if they don't fully believe it themselves, they will still run these tests. Or realistically, usually in these systems, you don't give them a choice to run these tests or not, right? You want to ensure that there is a consistent amount of testing throughout the company. And at this point, when other leaders and other engineers can come and ask for testing or ask for help, being like, hey, I'm thinking of this new feature, how can I test it? That's when you know you've reached a strong testing culture. So to recap again, we have non-existent, struggling, established, and strong. I just want to say here that this is not an exhaustive list. You could probably have like a few more steps above if that's what you feel like. And it's totally okay to feel like your company is on one step for one feature and at another for another. I think that this is the sort of thing that is multidimensional. So, and these concrete steps, like you can be in between a step, you can be like, maybe you're really strong on the automated part, but you're really weak on testing new features, like there are many multitudes in here, and that's perfectly fine. These are just a general guideline to understand where your company is at. So that's great. Like now we know how to gauge our company's interests. But how do we move on from here and fix or move on to the next stage of maturity, right? So in order to do that, I'm going to introduce another tool, right, which is going to be the checklist for change. So why do we need change? It's because technology is changing and our tests should too. So a fun little note here is like you can oscillate between steps 3 and 4 quite a bit. So you can go back and forth between established and strong. And the reason that I don't believe that strong is like, you're going to get to that step and you're going to stay there forever is because the technology changes. Maybe your whole company got reorganized and you need to change the way that you do testing. You're updating your best practices. There's a great new framework that came out and you're switching. Basically, whatever happens, like there are going to be changes down the line since technology is such an evolving space to work in. And as such, your best practices will change. So there will be some people that are hanging on to the old. There will be some people that are just gung-ho about the future. And you will kind of keep moving back from maybe during the reorganization, one of the teams fell behind. You need to kind of push them back up again. It's going to be a continuous process, right? So checklist for change. This is made up of several different steps, and I'm going to be going over this at the same time, like what these steps mean, as well as what we did at Pinterest to go from struggling to established, okay? So the checklist for change, you can do these steps at any stage in the testing maturity ladder that you're in. And they are evaluate, set goals, run some tests, demonstrate value, and normalize, right? So let's go into what these mean as well as what we did at Pinterest. Okay, so evaluate. In this step, you are looking at what you're doing currently. What does it look like? Is it worth keeping, right? It's important here to make sure that you're keeping in mind anything that you've done in the past, just because you don't want to spend all this time and effort doing something that someone else did some time ago and it didn't end up working, with the caveat that if enough time has gone by and the technology's advanced, it might be worth looking at again, right? Make sure you have a good inventory of what is working and what is broken, because the broken things you want to change, the working things you want to keep, right? Benchmarking is incredibly important at this step, and it's something that I didn't realize until later on in several of my journeys. The reason that benchmarking is so important is because it's easier to show value later on down the line. If you just kind of fix things and not really capture the state of where you are currently, it's going to be harder to prove, like, no, I swear this is like 10 times faster than it used to be, right? Get that proof now, right? So you can see here that we were struggling. These are our web tests. The top one is going to be our desktop web, and the bottom is going to be our mobile web. You can see we kind of had a stability problem. We had a 10% reliability here. We didn't build very often, and when we did, these were red, right? So if you look at the testing culture ladder, we were struggling, right? So we wanted to fix that. How do you fix it? Well, you set some goals, right? So here you're going to be setting milestones and success criteria. If you don't know where to start, I recommend starting with recurring problems. So in our fictional example, we start with search, right? So key things to keep in mind here: you should set a date. This keeps you from trying to iterate on your testing framework so much until it's perfect, because it is better to have something out in the hands of your company, of your teammates tomorrow, than it is to have something that you deem perfect, like, 3-4 months down the line, and then get feedback that it actually doesn't work for the team, right? So you're going to want to be iterating on this, and you want to build an MVP. Your goals are going to be your guardrails, right? You might have to reevaluate them later on, but they're going to give you a direction to run with, and that narrows down the problem a little bit, and that makes it a little bit easier to work with. If you can have a data-driven approach, that works best, but if you don't have any current metrics on what your system looks like, what the flaws are, that's okay. If you just kind of have a gut feeling, set that as your goal, you'll be fine too. Okay, so our goals at this time were to reduce the total failures on the pipeline. You saw that was pretty red. I think that's a pretty good goal. We wanted to create trust in test results because we had lost it from being so red for so long. And we wanted to have 0 deploys with failures because at the time, since everything was so red, they were deploying with it red, right? Which makes sense because that testing structure was not built for success. Okay, so now you run some tests. You want to make running of the tests as simple as possible to get the biggest number of people to run them as possible, right? But above all, you want it to be something that everyone can reproduce. This step is going to vary a lot based on where you already were on the test culture ladder, right? If you are at a non-existent place, running some tests means setting up the test framework and getting it into the company in the first place. If you're at a later stage, then you already have some established practices and you're just kind of tweaking variables, right? So this varies depending on your stage, and that's perfectly fine. What I do suggest regardless at this point is to just make sure that you document things at this stage, just because if you are changing variables, if you are introducing something new, you want to be able to give this documentation to someone and have them be able to replicate results. This documentation and being able to send it to someone else and replicate results is going to prevent you from being the bottleneck, which is especially important when you're at the non-existent stage, right? Excuse me. So at this stage, since we were struggling, we needed a lot of documentation and we needed a lot of general maintenance because we did have all these tests that were failing very consistently and not really a lot of idea why. So from here, you demonstrate value, right? How have you improved? And you advocate for yourself, which I know for some of us is very hard. But since you have your benchmarks, you can show very concretely how much of an improvement you have, and you should self-advocate for that as hard as possible, right? So here you're going to compare to your benchmarks. You're going to track your progress, like maybe just have like a little running note, or just have all the JIRA tickets that you filed as a result of your changes. You know, you're going to want to make sure that all of the progress that you made is captured in some way, shape, or form. That way you can show it to your management chain. So here you can see like the first screenshot is where we were. It's the one that I showed earlier when we started. The second one is where we finished when I think we moved into the established practice. And at this point, you can see it's pretty green. It's really awesome. Our reliability shot up, but not only that, you can see that our builds per week went up. And that to me was a great show that we did successfully move into the next step, right? So from here, you normalize. This is usually more effective at the higher up levels of the testing maturity ladder, but that should not stop you from trying to normalize this as soon as you can. And by normalize, I really mean we're just trying to build acceptance. We're trying to build testing into the public consciousness of our company. So in order to do this, you need to be vocal, right? You need to just make sure that everyone knows what you did, why it's important. Look at how much time we're saving. This is awesome, right? Distribute that knowledge. You wrote the documentation already, so it should be a little bit easier to go from this point and just show other people what you've done, how to do it. The best way I've found to do this is to infiltrate onboarding. New hires are the easiest minds to change because they don't have any preconceptions of your company. So if you can get your testing structures into the onboarding for new hires, you're kind of self-building this tolerance and acceptance of testing as you go. The more ownership you have, the less bottlenecks you'll have on yourself or on your testing team. And how we did this, how we're currently doing this at Pinterest is we've distributed test ownership to teams. So different teams will own their own tests. They can decide, like, do we use it or not? We have testing standards. We do have the testing stability that I mentioned earlier. We've really focused on stability, which I think has led to a lot of trust across the company. So just to give you a high-level overview of how we've moved, I think we've actually moved into a strong testing culture very recently, which is very exciting. And just in case you wanted some metrics to go along with it, when we were struggling, we only had about 63 tests. You've seen the pipeline was mostly red. We had very low stability. We didn't build very much, right? We moved from that into an established testing culture. We had 112 tests. You can see our pipeline was pretty green. We had a lot of builds a week and pretty high stability. Our speed isn't the best, but you know, what can you do? Now, today, we have a strong testing culture. We have 412 tests. We're pretty much green. Unfortunately, when I took the screenshot, there was a little bit of red, but you can see like our reliability is still pretty good. Mobile web stability is amazing, and our builds did go down, but that is mostly because we separated our tests to move into testing at different stages. So all this to say, your code is your house and you have to live in it. So wouldn't it be better if everyone helped clean up as well? Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jennifer. It was a great, very, very interesting, I think, session on how to build a testing culture. I think starting from scratch, you really broke it down well. All right, let's see if we can address some questions. Okay. So how do you? I think one of the first questions which I feel is very, very relevant is, you know, when you're in sort of a non-existent, or let's say you're just getting started and you're starting, right, build that testing culture. How do you get everybody on board, right, to improve testing? Because, you know, a lot of times it becomes a frustration at the end of the sprint. You're, you know, running against a deadline, trying to get things out, and you're in this sort of beginning stage of building a testing culture, and it could become a huge struggle. So how do you sort of stay through that and I guess as build that patience in the organization to stay the course?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's very hard to do so. But the good news is that if you have the right amount of persistence, usually people will see the value of testing. One of the things that I found was the best to sort of build trust and build investment in others is to really emphasize what improvements you made. That's why like benchmarking is so important. Like I've definitely slogged through improvements and then not really had too much to show. But if you can convince, whoever it is up the chain, it's like, hey, give me a sprint or two to just purely dedicate on testing, and I will just, keep track of all the metrics. And if we don't see like a 5%, 10% improvement, then I'll stop talking about this. You want to like kind of lowball yourself just because you don't know what your existing system is like, and you want to under promise, over deliver here. But realistically, the better your testing system is, the more ROI you're giving back in terms of stability. So if one of the things you might want to do is like, if your current system's very broken, if you know that there's a lot of time spent debugging why certain things are broken that really shouldn't be, like maybe your login or your search, like from the example that I was mentioning, just really try to capture that and be like, hey, we had 16 bugs last month about search. It took so long to fix them. If you let me have one recurring test on search, think of like, all those 5 bugs would be gone. We'd have so much time to work on something else. So just really try to pair the testing with the value that it returns, because people will recognize the value even if they don't recognize the testing, if that makes any sense.
Got it. Makes sense. Okay, so a follow on from that is how do you get other teams, right, who are not part of QA, right, to be, so how do you bring them on board from a best practice perspective and from, reporting, so a lot of times you're sharing reports after your tests are over with other teams across the organization. How do you get them all, into the same page?
So that's going to vary differently depending on the culture. I think that one of the things that helps people the most is understanding why you're doing something. I'm a big fan of context. My answers tend to be really long because I shove so much context into them. But I think that that's really what builds a better knowledge base in everyone. So if you have some documentation on what your testing structure is like why it's important, you really just basically want to sell the knowledge behind it, right? Like you want to make sure that everyone understands that yes, your team is running QA, but really you're doing it for the benefit of the other team, right? And that kind of goes back to the example I had previously of like, wow, you guys had 16 bugs. Wouldn't you like to have less bugs? Wouldn't you like it to be a little bit easier to debug where the problem is, because you know what's working, what isn't, right? Like you have a very strong value to the company, to the engineers. And if they need a little bit more persuasion, maybe you should try to find like what are their key metrics. Like maybe they operate on like how many tickets they close or like something like that. You want to find a way to tie in your organization with their outcome and just kind of prove that this is something that's beneficial for both of us.
Got it. Following on from that, when you're working with specifically, between QA and dev, do you have any sort of recommendations or techniques in terms of how do we improve the communication between teams and also the engagement in quotes, according to the question?
Okay. That's interesting. Most of the time that I've done this, it's been an individual effort on my part. If you were to kind of extrapolate this, I think personal connections are really good. They're very strong, right? Like if you get to know someone as a person, they'll be a little bit more willing to advocate you in general. If you can make friends on different sides of the fence, so to speak, then you can kind of come together, see each other's points a little bit better. This might work a little bit better higher up the chain. So where you have like, your manager and their manager and like, they understand the team's problems a little bit better. it is really hard to get that engagement up, especially if you don't have a lot of company buy-in. You can go manager by manager and kind of work your way up the chain, but if you're not at a place where it is going to be hard to get that engagement, just because a lot of people don't see the value. You're not going to get everyone, but I like to think that every person that you do kind of convert to seeing the light of testing is a plus for everyone involved.
Got it. Great. Okay. Couple more questions. So one is around, I think, velocity, right? So I think you went from like 200 to 400 tests at some point. And it looked like your velocity went down, right? So what do you do to keep your test suite from like getting bloated, and just getting out of control with thousands and thousands of tests?
Yeah, so one of the things that we emphasize is test ownership. My manager actually came up with like this beautiful write-up on what our testing values are, which is an interesting concept. And basically what we decided on, like as a testing team, which we then presented to all of our stakeholders, is that we believe that less is more. And that is a stance that we've taken on very strongly. So Ryan, if you're listening, here's a big shout out. So what this means is you don't need to have 20 million tests testing every single variant. And, with the big caveat that this might not work for every industry, you need to take, if you have like regulations that enforce that you have to, that's kind of nothing you can do about it. But if you can have one test that tests through like 80% of the problem, then you're pretty well covered. You don't need to test every single color variation or something like that if you don't really need to go through all that trouble, right? So what we emphasize to teams when they do take ownership of their tests is like, this is how many tests you have. Every test you add on has a cost in terms of maintenance. So you might want to evaluate how many tests you're running altogether, just because, there is some bloat. And that's not to say that we have reached a perfect solution with that. I don't think that that's like really possible without like consistent iteration and scrutiny and looking at like, okay, like we have like 5 of this same test, like do we really need them, right? So that really needs to come from within. But if you issue like this big standing document or like this kind of value that your team will uphold and introduce that as the standard for other people, they usually don't question it. So that helps too.
Got it. Awesome. All right. Okay, here's a great question. I think, at Pinterest, you've built a great sort of testing culture, right? So how are you, or how are teams measuring product quality, right? And like, have you been able to sort of come up with sort of a measurable difference of product quality? I mean, I'm sure you have, but like, how do you measure quality before and after?
That is a good question. I think that's actually something that we're trying to solve right now, because we have realized that we have certain metrics that don't necessarily tie in super well with the product quality. Like, from like the 1,000-yard line, there's definitely the thought that, well, if we have less failures, that means that our code is more stable, which is just kind of like a hand-wavy metric. But we are trying to figure out better ways to tie these two together. So far, the only metrics we've really used are in terms of like deploy speeds, like rollback prevention, that sort of thing. So it's all very like testing pipeline based right now and doesn't super tie into the product.
Got it. Can you, Jennifer, can you still hear me?
Yes. Oh, no, did I cut out?
Okay. No, I think my internet was acting up, so I lost your video feed there for a moment. Okay, let's see. I think we have maybe time for one more question. Okay, interesting question around documentation. I think you covered that early on in your presentation about documentation. How much documentation is in, or what documentation is enough? How do I prioritize what to document and what not to?
Yeah. Okay. So that is a great question. I love this question because it's something that I struggled with a very, very long time with. Okay. So how much documentation is kind of going to depend on where you are in maturity ladder, right? It's going to depend on how much time you as a person have. But generally speaking, I think the more documentation you have, the better. And the reason is basically because if you have it documented and you can like concretely point someone to like where they should be going to look for the information that they're asking, you don't have to repeat yourself, and that is magical, right? So in the beginning, when Pinterest was struggling, I was the sole person that was answering a bunch of questions, which, you know, took a disproportionate amount of my time to do. To the point that it was like just really affecting everything, because it's like, okay, I got another question. Okay, got another question. Okay, got another question, right? And really, once I started documenting, like, you know, like even having an FAQ of frequently asked questions is super helpful, because then, like, you know, you get that request in and you can just like, instead of like, you know, spending like 5 minutes typing out the answer, putting in the screenshot, you can just like point them to a site and just be like, go read it, you know, thank you for asking, here's the answer. That got asked a lot, right? So that's generally the stage that you want to get to. You want to be able to sort of point all of the frequent questions away and then maybe take on the more nuanced ones. I don't see this a lot, and it is kind of a pain to maintain, but I'm a big fan of screenshots, because there's definitely, when you go to a new company and when you have different systems, there's sometimes a little bit of overwhelm that happens from just like reading the instructions. So if you break them up with images, people tend to like it more. And sometimes, like, if the UI is a little bit tricky or whatever, it makes it easier for them to process what you're really trying to say at the end of the day.
Got it. Got it. Okay. There are a lot of questions around metrics, actually. So let's see. What you know, in I guess there are a couple of questions around ideal world. You know, what are the metrics that would be ideal for testing, right? Like if you could decide that these are the metrics that I should track at Pinterest for, you know, quality or for testing, for the testing team as a whole, what would you sort of, what are the 2 or 3 metrics that you would pick?
Yeah, so I think that this is very company dependent, which is interesting and I don't think talked about very often. The one metric I will say is important only to a certain extent is test coverage, right? You can't really expect like 100% testing coverage, because then you're over optimizing for like very little gain, especially like as your company scales. But you do want to have some minimum coverage, right? So like, let's say like I want like at least like 50% of my flows covered. Like I feel that that's a very important metric. I think that ease of use is like a horrible metric to say, but like if we could figure out how to actively track that, that would be 100% the metric that I would go for, because the easier the system is for other people to use, the more likely they're going to be using it and not bothering me about it, right? So if you can have your testing systems be easily structured, be easily runnable, and have a certain minimum of coverage, just by having those 3 alone, you will be building your own advocates, because people will be like, oh, wow, like I could save myself a bug if I just write a test, and look at how easy it is to create a new test. So like, you know, it just kind of builds on itself. The coverage is important just because, you know, you don't want to have everything on fire all the time. But realistically, I think if you invest more into having ease of use, that will pay greater dividends in the end.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Let's see. I think there's one question around CI/CD, basically around broad, you know, maybe some best practices. Or where do you think users should, what do you think users should focus on, you know, when you're putting in place sort of a CI/CD tool and that whole, you know, continuous testing and integration and delivery?
Yeah. So one of the things that I realized was the most important into even just getting your continuous integration started is testability. The reason we focused on it so much was because that was one of the things that was preventing us from the established level to going into the strong level, was our tests weren't stable. So we couldn't run the continuous integration very often because of all the flake, right? So if you reduce the amount of flake in your system, you will build your CI just a lot stronger, which helps in it's kind of a domino effect. Your tests are very stable, people trust the results, they're more likely to write them. Like, it just really builds on itself, like a lot of these things do. Stability is so very critical. It's very annoying to chase. I know that sometimes, you're just like looking at a flaky test, you like watched it run like 30 times and you're just like, I don't know what's happening here, right? So it is frustrating work, but it is very important, because that's actually the biggest thing that moved us from struggling to established, was getting that testability up. In terms of how to set up a CI/CD pipeline, I'm not the best at that. I don't profess to be, but I do think that if you can have that sort of trust in your testing, building the pipeline will be easier. And also, just as long as you're doing like a per PR, a per commit type situation, to where you're having your master branch or your main line just like be green as much as possible, like that's going to get you like 80-90% of the way to like having a very healthy deploy pipeline.
All right. Okay, and last question. I think this is something that was covered also in the Selenium panel discussion. You mentioned, dealing with tests which are just really flaky. What was your strategy at Pinterest in terms of trying to overcome flakiness?
Poor, in a nutshell. I don't think we've really narrowed it down to a science, so it is kind of an art right now. We do use a few tools that I think are very helpful. So we keep track of flakiness of each test, right? Because if you don't know if a test is flaky, you don't know to work on it, which like kind of makes sense. And it just lets you know the health of your pipeline overall. So we have a custom tool that's built in-house to kind of keep track of that, and we maintain it. And it's beautiful because we just redesigned it. And just basically identifying flaky tests is very important. Understanding what sort of levers your company has that might contribute to a flaky test is important. So early on, one of the things that we realized was that basically 100% of our tests were flaky. And the reason that was because our testing environment was unstable. So we moved to a more robust testing environment that just shot up the stability of the tests. But basically, once you identify a test, it is, to my experience, a very kind of manual process of like, well, like, is it the test itself that's wrong? Is it the product that's off? Like, do we have an experiment in play that could be altering this? All of these things will factor into the flakiness of your test and are important to just kind of troubleshoot before you realize, like, what if you do have a race condition? Because that's a very real thing, right? So all of these things, like, you have to kind of check one by one and then sort of get into the tests themselves. I will say that sometimes it is better to rewrite the test than to figure out why it's flaky, just kind of depending on how bad the situation is.
Got it. Awesome. Great. Well, thanks a lot, Jennifer. Thank you for taking the time out of your very busy day, I'm sure, and sort of helping us understand. I think you broke it down beautifully, building a testing culture. I think many teams are at various stages of this journey, and I think it was great to sort of hear from you on how to address some of the key challenges at different stages of this journey. So thanks again.
Yeah,
it was really enjoyed watching your presentation.
Bye.
Bye, Jennifer.